Welcome to the November 26th sale, Important Paintings in Contemporary Art. Before Ben and Lee and myself talk about some of the interesting work in a wonderfully diverse catalogue, just a little point of housekeeping. The auction will start at 6 p.m, so that's half an hour earlier than usual, 6 p.m. this coming Thursday the 26th here at Art+Object, 3 Abbey Street, Newton, and we start with the 36 lots from the Whakaara collection.
I'm going to talk to you about a couple of paintings which I love, but also which I think have had a really interesting life, and provenance is very much part of their value and part of the reason why they're here in this sale. The first painting, it's not so much a painting, it's a gouache by Gordon Walters, and it sits beside this wonderful Milan Merkasic. I think 2 years separate the two works. The painting Trees No. 2 by Milan Merkasic is from 1958, and the early Walters gouache I think is from 1959 to 1960. The Merkasic here comes from the collection of a gentleman called Geoffrey Ricks Trott. He was one of the founding trustees of the McKelvey Trust, and also a very notable architect who designed the Chelsea House down in Queen Street. Now, Chelsea House features a wonderful Merkasic, of which this could almost be taken from. It's a mosaic mural designed in 1958, and it features the same type of pointillist-inspired imagery. The gouache is particularly special. It comes from the collection of Emeritus Professor Michael Dunn, who will be known to followers of Walters through probably being the foremost opinion, I think, on the artist's work that there is around. He curated, of course, the 1983 Auckland Art Gallery retrospective of Gordon Walters, and also produced the monograph, which is still really the definitive publication on Walters' work. You won't find this in that publication, but it is in Dunn's own PhD thesis on the artist. And while he was conducting his thesis, I believe is around the time that he acquired this work from Walters, and he's had it ever since until today. What's particularly nice about this work is I think the first of the Walters Koru works appears in about 1956. This one some 3 years later, and we've got another work here which is a lovely contrast to it. I think it's probably more typical insofar it's black and white, and it's done with the more usual elements of the ruler and the compass. This one is freehand drawn. It's really wonderful insofar as it reveals a lovely little insight to a point in time where really that moment of the koru is just starting to blossom into something pretty special. From Trees 2 in 1958, we can transition right through into the middle of the 1960s, through the Emblem series and into this wonderful body of work known as the Element series. This one here is another painting with lovely history, really. It comes from the collection of a fascinating couple called Otto and Jocelyn Strew. Odo Strew was a landscape architect with the group, and Jocelyn Strew ran a cafe beside Barry Leck Galleries in the middle of the 1960s. I think it was known as Babel. She purchased this work from Barry Leck then, and it's been in the Strew family ever since. And I think it is probably the finest example of the Element series that I've ever seen come up at auction. Golden Passive Element is what it's called. You can see that lovely, rich, muted variations on gold, almost going through to brown in the periphery, surrounded by the blue frame. I think in this particular body of work, Merkasic was really searching for a clarity that he'd been striving for. I think he painted his first abstract painting in 1947, and by the time he gets to 1965, we get perhaps one of his finest and most well-resolved abstractions.
This is the second large-scale Tos Wollaston work from the early 1970s that we've offered this year. The first was, of course, Mapua from the Ronsang collection. This work, we believe, stands alone, a unique scene of the Queenstown region, and it really reveals Wollaston's incredible feel for the South Island landscape. This scene is really a painterly tour de force, and it seems to me a mixture of an expressionist approach to painting, but also, of course, we have the links and the echoes to Wollaston's great love, Cézanne. And I think it's a real testimony to Wollaston that he found endless new ways to look at the South Island landscape, and this distinctive Central Otago palette here of these dun browns, these apricot-y reds and rusty reds, and of course this lovely sense of Wakatipu and shadow from the afternoon sun there in the mountains makes this a really important and classic Tos Wollaston, very rare at this large scale.
We are fortunate to include 3 wonderful pieces by the artist Anne Robinson in this contemporary art catalogue. Robinson has been a pioneer in the method of glass casting in New Zealand and internationally for many years, and I think she probably became most well known to many of us through the exhibition organised by the Dowse Art Museum, Casting Light, in the late 90s. One of the key pieces in the sale would have to be the ice bowl, which was in fact included in that Dowse touring show, thanks to the generosity of its previous owners. Its wonderful organic nature makes us think about whether the artist was thinking about perhaps carving the piece out of solid ice. The other two pieces are interesting for their strong colour. Robinson talks about her deep interest in colour and the use of even hard colours, and that's particularly evident in this wonderful copper blue dark sunset spiral bowl, which for me references the Pacific and the organic. It's almost like a food bowl. And then of course we have the wonderful deep red cactus vase, which references the artist's interest again in nature and the organic and tree forms particularly.
Charles Goulding is one of the foundation stones of the New Zealand art story. And what we have here is an absolutely typical work from 1922, unique in its own way in that it was painted during a short stay in Sydney. But of course it is a classic Goldie. The subject with a Panne is one of Goldie's favourite sitters. He depicted her more than 10 times, and this particular work has a wonderful sense of the relationship, in my opinion, between Goldie and the sitter. Now of course we have to acknowledge that there was a time when Goldie's work was out of fashion. There was a sense that his work had become overly sentimental, and the emphasis on a dying race, which history fortunately proved to be incorrect, led to him being out of favour in the 1930s and 40s when the real effects of modernism were starting to hit New Zealand. But what we see when we look at these works very, very closely is a sense of personal connection between Goldie, the human, and his sitter, another human being, that ensures that these works do not descend into being purely emblematic.
It's not uncommon for us to have fantastic photographs in this catalogue, but this is really something special. It comes from Australia. It's an image by Max du Panne, who's probably Australia's most well-known photographer, and this is without doubt his most well-known image. It's called The Sunbaker, and it dates to 1937, although interestingly it wasn't printed until the 1980s. And that's the same for all of the Sunbaker images. It was an image which Max du Panne took, which he never really kind of grasped onto the popularity of the significance of the image when he took it. And it really stayed as a negative and wasn't printed at all until the 1980s when a retrospective of his work was held by the Centre for Contemporary Photography in Australia. And since then I think it's become the most iconic and widely disseminated image of Australia. It's probably particularly important through the strength of the modernist composition. You can see the contrast between the light and the shade, the way du Panne has taken the image from a low vantage point, aiming up at the figure reclining on the sand there, and in doing so it's really sort of cast him into a sort of a triangular form that is very, very strong on the scorching Australian sun in the horizon on the background. It's a photograph which I think encapsulates an optimism prior to the war, a happiness, and which in a way has come, without exaggeration, to define a sense of Australian identity.
It's no coincidence that these two works here by Brent Wong here below and Don Binney above are sitting here together. These are two artists who in the New Zealand art history story really burst onto the scene in their early 20s. I'm going to talk about the Don Binney work here, Waiti No. 1 from 1964. This was painted when Don Binney was 24, and he burst onto the New Zealand scene with his distinctive, pretty much fully formed style, with these black lined, like lead lights and stained glass windows, outlines in which these lovely sensuous ornithological scenes are depicted. This particular work is a little different from many of his other works in that the palette is more restrained, it's subtitled to Hinga, and it's obviously depicting those marshlands around the waterways in the dunes behind Tahinga. And you can see that classic west coast scudding grey sky. Let's say it's a dawn scene, and we have two weka there in the marshlands sheltering from this symbolic bird of prey, a harrier perhaps overhead. What Binney has done with this scene, on the one hand, reveals the drama of this particular moment, but is a real triumph of compositional and even sculptural arrangement of form in this tall, angular work on board.